the topic of today, using your energetic sensitivity to make better decisions. You listed three things that we sort of all need to tap into and understand. So why don't you just start the first one and give us a little more scope on that?
Okay, thank you. Innate knowledge is something that most people attribute intuition to. Innate knowledge happens when the more experience you get, the more understanding. I talked to an aircraft mechanic. I'll give you an example. I talked to an aircraft mechanic, and he said, you got to follow the procedures all the way. When you first get started, it's the same for nurses. You follow the procedures, you look at the charts, and you do everything else. But then over time, you get enough experience that all of a sudden those things aren't really what you're looking at. You're looking at cues. So if in the case of a nurse, you'd be looking at patient cues, and you would be looking for specific signals that they fall within a pattern, in which case the diagnosis would be on correct, or that don't follow a pattern, in which case you then know something else is going on. So these are things that are part of your intuitive makeup. It works for pilots as well, in terms of innate knowledge. You do certain things. But the process for response in this is milliseconds. It's like you blink your eye and it's about, I think it's 300 to 450 milliseconds just to blink your eye. When you make a decision in high stakes environments, it's less than that. So innate knowledge is sort of that pool of experience that you've got that and decisions you've made in the past that sort of all pile up, so that when you're in a pinch, your processor, your subconscious processor, just goes rattling through those and runs through a whole series of possibilities, and then bam, picks one out. So that innate knowledge, then, that part of your intuition is strengthened by making more decisions. So one of the things that people are doing now is making fewer decisions because they're afraid of being wrong. Well, you're actually working against yourself under those conditions. The more decisions you make, even if they're wrong, the more data you have to work with when you're looking at that strength of intuition, which is innate knowledge. So that's the first one.
So from my point of view, that's what I call distilled wisdom. Is that
nice.
We have garnered this inside ourselves at a point we come to trust it. So that becomes our distilled wisdom. And then we bring in the other, without second guessing ourselves, which is what you're saying too, is a lot of people are second guessing their decisions now. And not to do that, but to really trust what they're feeling and what they're recognizing. So which leads into the non-local intuition.
Well, and it's funny because I'll give you an example out of when I was talking about the nurses and health. I was doing a workshop in Sweden, and we were describing these three different aspects. And one of the people in the workshop who's given me permission to share this story said he was there when his baby was born, and out of nowhere came the word blue, and he said the word blue, and the nurse picked up the baby right away and began putting the baby through a medical procedure. It turns out, and there's the nurses who are listening to this will know exactly what happened. I don't, but exactly what was happening. Had he not said that, it's hard to say whether or not the baby would be alive today, because essentially he picked up non-locally, it was precognizant, in other words, not consciously, picked up what was going on for that baby, which is that medical condition. So, and I think for the nurse, it meant that the nurse right away got a confirmation that something was wrong, and she responded instantly. So that's a good example. There's lots of examples that are both positive and good news and bad news. There's a great story out of the United States about a woman who was at work and she just had a bad feeling about her husband and something going wrong, and so she left work, drove home, and found him pinned under a car, and had the car was jacked up. So that's another good example. Someone else in another workshop I did more recently said that he had a feeling about a friend of his that she was pregnant, and he called her up and she was pregnant. So these are non-local transfer of information. It's simultaneous. It does not have to be, it's without you actually knowing anything. It's just a simple transfer of information across time and space. So that's what we would call non-local.
Okay. I know that in the past I've experienced just even thinking of asking a question, and all of a sudden within a few minutes the person I'm dialoguing with has responded, and we've done it all non-verbally. So that's kind of what you're saying.
Very much so. Very good example, great example, very much so. That's a good example of how, and it can happen if you're an empath, if you're taking in a lot of strong, the highly sensitive, taking in a lot of information. I personally, and this is, something I'm very aware of, but I've personally been in conversations where I've not even been aware of the content of the conversation is directly relevant to what's going on to the person in the moment. And there's nothing they've told me about it. There's nothing that we haven't had a conversation about that. But all of a sudden it will hit home and they'll say, wow, you have no idea how relevant that is. And I go, well, why did that line of even happen?
Yeah.
How did we get there? And it's very much because you're always taking in, absorbing emotional and social data from your environment, and it gives you clues. So, yeah.
And that goes into the next, and the third thing you mentioned was the energetic sensitivity of being really aware of what's happening around you.
Yeah, the energetic sensitivity, it relates directly to what I just said about emotional and social data. So you have your heart. Your heart is a field of energy, and it emanating from that is it's mapped. You can go online. It's in Decision Making for Dummies. There's a map of it from the HeartMath Institute. You can also Google the HeartMath Institute and find it. They've done a couple of very nice videos on this, and some lovely little images that illustrate how your heart emanates data, basically. How you're feeling.
Right.
And so if you're feeling well, then you're setting an environment around you of wellness, of well-being, of joy, of happiness, whatever the positive emotion is. But if you're unhappy, you're setting up what's called a discoherent field. So that simply means if you're grumpy, it spreads. And you'll know that when you walk into certain environments where you feel, ooh, this energy doesn't feel right. It could be because there's a bit of anger in the space, or there's been anger in the space. Or I know there's a wonderful story at the back end of the Shawshank Redemption with Tim Robbins, where he took his son into the jail that they used to shoot the Shawshank Redemption. And his son basically walked in and said, Daddy, we have to leave here. There are very sad things that happened here. And that's a great example of someone who's very sensitive to energy, who just walked in, picked up on it immediately. A kid, who tend to be less, they tend to screen out, they don't tend to screen out what they're saying or seeing, they just say it. But as adults, we've conditioned ourselves not to talk about what can't be touched, or, we tend not to do that. And I think that has to change, because it's data and it's information that we're using in our decisions, whether we know it or not. So that's the energetic sensitivity part. The trick with it is that if you're not aware of the fact you're energy sensitive, then you can end up with chronic illness. You can end up with all sorts of confusion around who you are, why you're here. You can not be, you can be operating in a confused state a fair amount of time. So there's a lot of physical things that come from it. My own personal experience with that was after working in a lot of high-end conflict environments, facilitating solutions, I would be taken out for the next 3 days. And at one point it got so bad I could only crawl down the hallway of my house. And so I drove myself to hospital, and they said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. So that was, that sort of that was in conflict with what I was experiencing. And eventually I learned how to clear up my energy field before and after those kinds of situations. And now, of course, over time you learn you get some more refined skills on how to separate what's you from the environment and all of that. So energetic sensitivity is probably one of the strengths of intuition that calls for a pretty high level of mastery. The skills are both macro and meta. So macro skills in terms of observing your environment and seeing what the cues are and just walking in and being able to see. But the metadata is more, what am I sensing? Is it me or is it someone else? So there's a certain amount of experimentation, not drawing conclusions, not drawing judgments, but just making a lot of observations. And so it really takes you down an incredible path that ultimately leads to a greater clarity of purpose. And so for some people, it's been as simple as getting into the field of Qigong or one of those energy balancing type of movements that help you clear keep your energy balanced. So it is definitely an area of it's like a whole university in itself. Let's put it that way.